Hello, ladies and gents, it's Hagbard Celine here on another beautiful afternoon, and today I've decided I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to read some passages out of the book that I read during my brief vacation. The book is one that I have read before, and I believe I have actually mentioned it before on several of the little podcasts that I do. The title of the book is Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. In the description of this video will be a link to a downloadable PDF free of this book, and I would advise that anyone with some free time and an interest in the subject should probably download it and read it, as it makes quite a compelling case for some of the problems that are going wrong in today's society. And in spite of the fact that he seems to have a lot of anti-right-wing rhetoric quite early on, it's somewhat understandable, this being written in the 1960s. He's still recovering from what we would call McCarthyism. That being said, the very end of this book is indeed a scathing critique on the future of education in America, and he does actually warn and call this movement progressive education. And he's not wrong. So for that reason, if nothing else, and in the spirit of understanding the idea of the roots of anti-intellectualism, he goes through quite a bit of the theological and religious history of the founding of America that, if nothing else, I think a lot of my atheist viewers and even some of my Christian viewers might find quite interesting. Without further ado, I'm just going to read some passages from this book now, and then we're going to close the video out. So if you're interested, just put this on in the background and we'll do a small overview of the introduction and part of the first chapter. So here goes. This book is a critical inquiry, not a legal brief, for the intellectuals against the American community. I have no desire to encourage the self-pity to which intellectuals are sometimes prone by suggesting that they have been vessels of pure virtue set down in Babylon. One does not need to assert this or to assert that intellectuals should get sweeping indulgence or exercise great power in order to insist that respect for intellect and its functions is important to the culture and the health of any society, and that in ours this respect has often been notably lacking. No one who lives among intellectuals is likely to idealize them unduly, but their relation as fallible persons to the vital function of intellect should remind us of the wisdom of the Church, which holds that although the priesthood is vulnerable to the errors and sins of the flesh, the Church itself remains holy. Even here, however, I do not forget that intellect itself can be overvalued, and that reasonable attempts to set it in its proper place in human affairs should not be called anti-intellectual. One does not care to dissent when T.S. Eliot observes that intellectual ability without the more human attributes is admirable only in the same way as the brilliance of a child chess prodigy. But in a world of dangers, the danger that American society as a whole will overesteem intellect or assign it such a transcendent value as to displace other legitimate values is one that hardly need trouble us. Possibly the greatest hazard of this venture is that of encouraging the notion that anti-intellectualism is commonly found in a pure or unmixed state. It seems clear that those who have some quarrel with intellect are almost always ambivalent about it. They mix respect and awe with suspicion and resentment. And this has been true in many societies and phases of human history. In any case, anti-intellectualism is not the creation of people who are categorically hostile to ideas. Quite the contrary. Just as the most effective enemy of the educated man may be the half-educated man, so the leading anti-intellectuals are usually men deeply engaged with ideas, often obsessively engaged with this or that outworn or rejected idea. Few intellectuals are without moments of anti-intellectualism. Few anti-intellectuals without single-minded intellectual passions. Insofar as anti-intellectualism becomes articulate enough to be traced historically or widespread enough to make itself felt in contemporary controversy, it has to have spokesmen who are at least to some degree competent. These spokesmen are in the main neither the uneducated nor the unintellectual, but rather the marginal intellectuals, would-be intellectuals, unfrocked or embittered intellectuals, the literate leaders of the semi-literate, full of seriousness and high purpose about the causes that bring them to the attention of the world. I found anti-intellectual leaders who were evangelical ministers, many of them highly intelligent, and even some learned fundamentalists articulate about their theology. Politicians, including some of the shrewdest, businessmen, or other spokesmen of the practical demands of American culture, right-wing editors of strong intellectual pretensions and convictions, various marginal writers vide the anti-intellectualism of the beatniks, anti-communist pundits, offended by the past heresies of a large segment of the intellectual community, and, for that matter, communist leaders, who had as much use for intellectuals when they could use them, but the utmost contempt for what intellectuals were concerned with. The hostility so prominent in the temper of these men is not directed against ideas as such, not even in the case against intellectuals as such. The spokesmen of anti-intellectualism are almost always devoted to some ideas, and much as they much hate the regnant intellectuals among their living contemporaries, they may be devotees of some intellectuals long dead, Adam Smith, perhaps, or Thomas Aquinas, or John Calvin, or even Karl Marx. It would also be mistaken, as well as uncharitable, to imagine that the men and women who from time to time carry the banners of anti-intellectualism are of necessity committed to it as though it were a positive creed or a kind of principle. In fact, anti-intellectualism is usually the incidental consequence of some other intention, often some justifiable intention. Hardly anyone believes himself to be against thought and culture. Men do not rise in the morning, grin at themselves in their mirrors, and say, "Ah, today I shall torment an intellectual and strangle an idea." Only rarely, and with the gravest of misgivings then, can we designate an individual as being constitutionally anti-intellectual. In any case, it would be of little value to this enterprise, and certainly of no concern of mine, to classify or stigmatize individuals. What is important is to estimate the historical tendency of certain attitudes, movements, and ideas. With respect to these, some individuals will appear now on one side and now on another. In fact, anti-intellectualism is often characteristic of forces diametrically opposed to each other. Businessmen and labor leaders may have views of the intellectual class which are surprisingly similar. Again, progressive education has had its own strong anti-intellectual element, and yet its harshest and most determined foes, who are right-wing vigilantes, manifest their own anti-intellectualism, which is, though different in style, less equivocal and more militant. To be confronted with a simple and unqualified evil is no doubt a kind of luxury, but such is not the case here. And if anti-intellectualism has become, as I believe it has, a broadly diffused quality in our civilization, it has become so because it has often been linked to good or at least defensible causes. It first got its strong grip on our ways of thinking because it was fostered by an evangelical religion that also pervaded many humane and democratic sentiments. It made its way into our politics because it became associated with our passion for equality. It has become formidable in our education, partly because our educational beliefs are evangelically egalitarian. Hence, as far as possible, our anti-intellectualism must be excised from the benevolent impulses upon which it lives by constant and delicate acts of intellectual surgery which spare these impulses themselves. Only in this way can anti-intellectualism be checked and contained. I do not say eliminated altogether, for I believe not only that this is beyond our powers, but also that an unbridled passion for the total elimination of this or that evil can be as dangerous as any of the delusions of our time. I have suggested that one of the first questions asked in America about intellect and intellectuals concerns their practicality. One reason why anti-intellectualism has changed in our time is that our sense of what impracticality of intellect has been transformed. During the 19th century, when business criteria dominated American culture almost without challenge, and when most businesses and professional men attained eminence without much formal education, academic schooling was often said to be useless. It was assumed that schooling existed not to cultivate certain distinctive qualities of mind, but to make personal advancement possible. For this purpose, an immediate engagement with the practical tasks of life was held to be more usefully educative, whereas intellectual and cultural pursuits were called unworldly, unmasculine, and impractical. In spite of the coarse and Philistine rhetoric in which this contention was often stated, it had a certain rude correspondence to the realities and demands of American life. This skepticism about formally cultivated intellect lived on into the 20th century, but in our time, of course, American society has grown greatly in complexity and in involvement with the rest of the world. In most areas of life, a formal training has become a prerequisite to success. At the same time, the complexity of modern life has steadily whittled away the functions the ordinary citizen can intelligently and comprehendingly perform for himself. In the original American populist dream, the omnicompetence of the common man was fundamental and indispensable. It was believed that he could, without much special preparation, pursue the professions and run the government. Today, he knows that he cannot even make his breakfast without using devices, more or less mysterious to him, which expertise has put at his disposal, and when he sits down to breakfast and looks at his morning paper, he reads about a whole range of vital and intricate issues and acknowledges, if he is candid with himself, that he has not acquired the competence to judge most of them. In the practical world of affairs, then, trained intelligence has come to be recognized as a force of overwhelming importance. What used to be jocular and usually benign ridicule of intellect and formal training has turned into a malign resentment of the intellectual in his capacity as expert. The only idea of the woolly-minded intellectual, so aptly caught in the stereotype of the absent-minded professor, still survives, of course, but today it is increasingly a wishful and rather wistful defense against a deep and important fear. Once the intellectual was gently ridiculed because he was not needed. Now he's fiercely resented because he is needed too much. He has become all too practical, all too effective, and he's the object of a resentment because of an improvement, not a decline, in his fortunes. It is not his abstractness, futility, or helplessness that makes him prominent enough to inspire virulent attacks, but his achievements, his influences, his real comfort and imagined luxury, as well as the dependence of a community upon his skills. Intellect is resented as a form of power or privilege. It may be said, at once, that what we all really have in mind here is not so much the intellectual as expert, that many intellectuals are not experts with an important role in public life, and that many of them do not impinge very forcibly upon the public consciousness. This is beyond argument, but my point is that the prevailing attitude towards intellectuals is set largely by those intellectuals who do so impinge. In the main, intellectuals affect the public mind when they act in one of two capacities, as experts or as ideologues. In both capacities, they evoke a profound and, in a measure, legitimate fears and resentments. Both intensify the prevalent case of helplessness in our society, the expert by quickening the public's resentment of being the object of constant manipulation, and the ideologue by arousing the fear of subversion and by heightening all the other grave psychic stresses that have come with modernity. For almost 30 years, anyone even moderately informed about public affairs has had to become aware of the machinery through which the expert was making himself felt. At first, during the New Deal, the well-publicized Brain Trust and all the ramifying agencies of control were set up to cope with the Depression, and during the war, there was the Office of Strategic Services and the Office of Scientific Research and Development, today the CIA and AEC, the Rand Corporation, the President's Council of Economic Advisors, and all the agencies that conduct research on the instruments and strategy of war, deal with issues that are beyond the reach of the ordinary man's scrutiny, but which can, and often do, determine his fate. A large segment of the public willingly resigns itself to political passivity in a world in which it cannot expect to make well-founded judgments. But in the management of public affairs and private business, where small politicians and small businessmen used to feel that most matters were within their control, these men have been forced since the days of FDR to confront better educated and more sophisticated experts, to their continued frustration. Along with the general public, such men now take part less vitally and less knowledgeably in the making of important decisions. The less they understand the inner world of power, the more apt they are to share and arouse popular suspicions of the uses to which power is put. The small-town lawyers and businessmen who are elected to Congress cannot hope to expropriate the experts from their central advisory role, but they can achieve a kind of revenge through congressional investigation and harassment, and, understandably, they carry on this task full of a sense of virtuous mission. There have been, after all, innumerable defeats and failures of expert-initiated policy, and these failures loom in the eyes of millions, as the consequences not simply of human error, but of cold and cynical manipulation, conspiracy, even treason. The public careers of Alger Hiss and others have given them symbols to which this feeling can be attached, and a few spectacular instances of demonstrated espionage involving scientific knowledge seem to substantiate their image of a world run by the power of secrets and swarming with the stealers of secrets. The advice of experts in the physical sciences, however suspect many of these experts may be, is accepted as indispensable. Expertise in the social sciences, on the other hand, may be rejected as gratuitous and foolish, if not ominous. One congressman objected in these words to including the social sciences in the National Science Foundation. "Outside of myself, I think everyone thinks he is a social scientist. I am sure that I am not, but I think everyone else seems to believe that he has some particular God-given right to decide what other people ought to do. The average American does not want some expert running around prying into his life and his personal affairs, and deciding for him how he should live. And if the impression becomes prevalent in Congress that this legislation is going to establish some sort of an organization in which there would be a lot of short-haired women and long-haired men messing into everyone's personal affairs and lives, inquiring whether they love their wives or do not love them and so forth, you're not going to get your legislation." And from this politician's point of view, experts were irritating enough in the time of FDR, when they seemed to have free access to the White House, while the president kept the politicians at arm's length. The situation has grown worse in the age of the Cold War, when matters of the highest public interest are susceptible to judgment only by specialists. All this is the more maddening, as Edward Shills has pointed out, in a populistic culture which has always set a premium on government by the common man and through the common judgment, which believes deeply in the sacred character of publicity. Here the politician expresses what a large part of the public feels. The citizen cannot cease to need or be at the mercy of experts, but he can achieve a kind of revenge by ridiculing the wild-eyed professor, the irresponsible brain-truster, or the mad scientist, and by applauding the politicians as they pursue a subversive teacher, the suspect scientist, or the allegedly treacherous foreign policy advisor. There has always been, in our national experience, a type of mind which elevates hatred to a kind of creed. For this mind, group hatreds take the place in politics similar to the class struggle in other modern societies, filled with obscure and ill-directed grievances and frustrations, with elaborate hallucinations and secrets and conspiracies. Groups of malcontents have found scapegoats in various times in the Masons, the abolitionists, Catholics, Mormons, Jews, Negroes or immigrants, the liquor interests or international bankers. In the succession of scapegoats chosen by the followers of this tradition of know-nothingism, the intelligentsia have at last, in our time, found a place. The overwhelming demands of the task of winning a continent and establishing its industries drew men from pursuits where profits and honors were less available. But there was more to it than this. Business in America at its highest levels appealed not merely to greed and the lust for power, but to the imagination. Alluring the builder, the gamester, and the ruler of men, it offered more sport than hunting and more power than politics. As de Tocqueville remarked, "In democracies, nothing is greater or more brilliant than commerce, and its devotees engaging in it, not only for the sake of profit it holds out to them, but for the love of the constant excitement occasioned by its pursuit." Except in a few older communities, there were no countervailing classes or sets of values, no aristocracy to marry into, no formidable body of national aspirations, outside of business aspirations. Business not only appealed to vigorous and ambitious men, but set the dominant standards for the rest of society, so that members of the professions, law, medicine, school teaching, even the ministry, aped businessmen, and adapted the standards of their own craft to those businesses. It has often been one of the perennial complaints of intellectuals in America that they cannot have much rapport with the professional classes as such, because these have been swung into the business orbit. It was business, finally, that isolated and feminized culture by establishing the masculine legend that men are not concerned with the events of the intellectual and cultural world. Such matters were to be left to women. All too often the type of women whom Edith Wharton said that they were so afraid to meet culture alone that they hunted it in packs. Both our religion and our business have been touched by the pervasive and aggressive egalitarianism of American life, but egalitarian spirit is still more effective in politics and education. What we loosely call Jacksonian democracy completed the disestablishment of a patrician leadership that had been losing its grip for some time. At an early date, literature and learning were stigmatized as the pejorative of a useless aristocracy, and the argument was not pressed any less firmly because a large part of the American intellectual class actually supported democratic causes. It seemed to be the goal of the common man in America to build a society that would show how much can be done without literature and learning, or rather a society whose literature and learning would be largely limited to such elementary things as the common man could grasp and use. Hence, early 19th century America was more noted for a wide range of literacy and for the unusual amount of information, independence, self-respect, and public concern possessed by the ordinary citizen than it was for encouragement of first-rate science or letters, or for the creation of first-rate universities. Again and again, but particularly in recent years, it has been noticed that intellect in America is resented as a kind of excellence, as a claim to distinction, as a challenge to egalitarianism, as a quality which almost certainly deprives a man or a woman of the common touch. The phenomenon is most impressive in education itself. American education can be praised, not to say defended, on many counts. But I believe that ours is the only educational system in the world, vital segments of which have fallen into the hands of people who joyfully and militantly proclaim their hostility to intellect and their eagerness to identify with children who show the least intellectual promise. The final segments of this book, though necessarily fragmentary as history, will show how this educational force has been built upon widely accepted premises in our thinking, a narrowly conceived preference for utility and science, a false variety of egalitarianism, and a primitivist view of the child. This book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, was published in 1963 by Richard Hofstadter, and it won the 1964 Pulitzer Prize. I think quite fairly. And again, I could not possibly advise more that you go read this book. It basically traces the origins of why we're here now, and I think Richard Hofstadter was probably one of the first people to wake up to this. And if you enjoyed this little reading and you'd like to see more of this kind of thing, please, seriously, let me know in the comments section. And beyond that, I think if you did enjoy this, the next one I'm going to do is going to be the 48 Laws of Power, in which I will simply read an entire summary of the 48 laws as well as the examples, because I think it's that important. But only if you guys are interested and willing to sit through it. If not, I'm not going to waste all of our time. As usual, everyone, thanks for sitting through this. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back next Tuesday, and I will be resuming my regular schedule. We'll see what kind of content I create, as I've become somewhat bored with your basic response videos. If you guys have any articles or anything like that you'd like to send me, or any people, speakers, educators, names you'd like to drop and have me research and, let's say, do an expose or something on, let me know. But for now, stay safe, good luck, and goodbye.